Hey peers, welcome back to the Modern Myths Podcast. I'm Vince Ventura, Artistic Director of 12 Peers Theater and your host for the Modern Myths Podcast. Today we're joined by Liz Leighton, playwright of Cry in the Shower. We have some great questions to ask Liz, but before we do, we want to hear from you. We want you to reach out to us on Facebook and Twitter with your questions, and we'll answer them on next week's episode of the Modern Myths Podcast. We also want to give a shout out to our good friends at Musical Theater Artists of Pittsburgh. They're having open submissions for their Hot Metal Musicals Incubator, and they're going to be giving 3 new musicals a workshop this year. So if you're in the Pittsburgh area, head over to their website, mtap.weebly.com, that's mtap.weebly.com, and submit your piece for consideration. Now, here's our interview with Liz Leighton, playwright of Cry in the Shower. So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and when did you start writing plays?
I've lived my entire life in Wisconsin. I grew up just outside of Madison. The very first full-length play I wrote was, in the 5th grade, so I would have been about 11 or 12, and it was a kind of my perception of a Regency comedy of manners, sort of, because I thought Oscar Wilde was, the shit at the time. It was kind of passed around among the faculty, and they had mixed reactions to it. That's kind of where, the part about Lena's friend Chelsea being in the gifted class was, because I was in the gifted class, but at my school, being in the gifted class didn't really mean much.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, that's interesting. That's rather young for writing plays. That's actually really impressive. How many plays have you written at this point?
I think I have 5 good full lengths under my belt right now. I am a compulsive writer, so I've also got a lot of goofy or weird or just unworkable stuff out there. But, I'm constantly just always writing things down. Even at night when I'm trying to fall asleep, I just think of conversations that I'll never have or that nobody will ever have. And sometimes I feel compelled to write them down.
Who gets you going? Who's your inspiration? Do you have a favorite playwright?
I switch favorite playwrights pretty consistently. I love Martin McDonagh. Mm-hmm. I love that approach to, I heard something about him kind of hating theater, which makes sense. I like the idea of a playwright who kind of has disdain for plays, because I think theater needs to take a direction where it's not looking backwards but forwards and kind of altering the plan so that it is more appealing to a contemporary audience, because right now the primary audience is either really old or other theater people, and I think we need to start looking at who, non-theater people, and get them interested in potentially paying for a ticket.
I think you're speaking our language with a lot of that. I think that's kind of what's launching this podcast, and I think that's why this is such a great fit, working together on this.
I know, it's great, and it's so much more comfortable, because I always feel the urge to dress up when I go see a performance, but now I can listen to it in my pajamas while I'm messing around the house or whatever.
What's your writing process like? I know that you're always writing, but do you see one thing through to completion, or do you have multiple projects in the air?
One of the things that's really difficult for me is to actually get a full length in a Word document. So the way I wrote Cry in the Shower, for example, is I am so all over the place with different ideas that I'm writing down that I had to sit down and tape different pieces of paper on my wall because I pinned them in because my apartment back then was just kind of a place where it had this really tacky clapboard wall in my bedroom, so I could pin it in. And as I went through my day, or every time I went into my room and had an idea, it was just right in front of me. I could see where everything was. I could see what came when, and I could just write it down in a spot. And that's when I could keep things in order. And sometimes it was just a general idea of what was happening. Sometimes it was a specific line. Sometimes I'd staple 10 pages of dialogue that I had written while I was supposed to be paying attention to somebody else at lunch, you know? So that's what that process was like. It really depends. I have another play that I wrote where I didn't even have to write anything down. I just sat down at a Word document and just burped it out. It's really different for everything, and it all depends on what kind of mood I'm in. I mean, when I wrote Crying in the Shower, that was a month where I had just written 7 full-length plays in a month just because, like, they were in me at the time.
It's a lot of output.
Yeah, I've never had a month like that since, and I don't know what it was. It was just kind of a freak accident, really, but
I think we all would love those kind of accidents.
I don't know because like 4 or 5 months after that, I didn't write anything at all. I just sort of wore myself out.
When you pour out all these characters and actions and circumstance, does it get in your head at all?
I'm sort of a person who has difficulty understanding that not everybody is obsessively interested in the same things that I'm obsessively interested in.
I can relate to that.
So sometimes when I'll be writing a play about something, I'll get really into it and start researching it. And, you know, God bless my friends, but sometimes they just like, okay, we know, like, we want to talk about other things now. How's the weather? You know, especially when it's something kind of grotesque that I'm writing about or a bizarre happening in history. I remember one time I just had pages and pages about Cabrini Green in the 80s because I wanted to do something with that. And, you know, not everybody's interested in the feudal warfare in Chicago gangs in the 1980s. So,
You know, I think that the magic of what playwrights do is to take all that data that they've poured over and give it life in action in a way that makes it digestible to most people.
exactly. And there's kind of this line a lot of people say the word populist like it's a dirty word, but on the other hand, if it's all about you and it's just a personal project, then you have to sacrifice the fact that it's going to be difficult to communicate it to the general public. So what I aspire to do is actually take some of the things that I'm obsessed with and put it into kind of a general structure that's tried and true and more digestible and communicate through the narrative why I care about these people or these situations. In that way, I don't really think of myself as an artist so much as a mechanic. I don't relate so much to the person playing the violin as I do to the person who made the violin because if the wood doesn't want to go a certain way or if it doesn't work a certain way, you can't force it. You need to work with everything else and just construct it.
That's a very interesting position. As a director, I oftentimes consider myself an interpretive artist. But to hear you say that you feel like, you're working with something and not necessarily creating from scratch, but taking parts and putting something together in order to communicate, that's a very
Well, I
interesting.
mean, pretty much, I'm going to say 99.9% of the stories out in the world are human stories. And the human story has been happening since the beginning of time. So every story that's told is just kind of already there. It's just got to be reworked into something new or compelling or something that touches people in a way that it didn't do before. And in that way, I think all writers have to work with something that's already there.
We are big fans of the monomyth and Joseph Campbell, which is obviously reflected in the title of the podcast. So you are singing our song all day today.
Hmm.
So let me ask you. Here's a fun question. What would you ask your characters, specifically in Cry in the Shower? But we're interested in other plays. What would you ask them if you could meet them in person?
Oh, wow, that's a very conceptual question. Um,
Given the fact that your characters are of you, but not necessarily distinctly you.
yeah, I know, right? Because I feel like I'd answer their question for them in a way, but I would probably ask all of them, what do you think it's like to be other people? People who were raised normally,
Sure.
and what would happen. I would like to ask Lena, like, what do you think it's like to have been raised by normal parents? What do you think it would be like to have received physical affection? How do you think you'd be better off right now? Do you think you'd be worse?
That's an
Um,
interesting question to ask just about anyone because I feel like there's a point when you get out into the world, perhaps it's when you graduate high school, but you start to look around and you go, not every family is like my family in a
I
few
know.
distinct little ways. So let me ask you this. What do you want the audience to walk away with after listening to Act 1 and Act 2 of Cry in the Shower?
Well, primarily, the first thing I want with all my plays is to help people forget about their own lives for a little while. Um, and I just want them to be entertained and engaged, and hopefully maybe get to the second level where like they kind of think about their own lives and remind themselves of aspects of themselves that they didn't know they had, or weren't there before and were there now, and probably just re-examine what's going on with other people.
Okay, so I was curious about this upon first reading. What do you think this play has to say about the nature versus nurture debate?
Yeah, that's something I think about a lot because there's really no way that you can know for sure if a person is like part a product of their genetic coding or if they're a product of the way they were raised. And it's probably a combination of both, but it could kind of lead you to wonder, what if Lena had been raised in a conventional setting? And I think people can imagine the differences or the similarities. But in the end, I think it implies that it's a combination of both things.
But it does beg the question, what if the rules of suffering were not in place? But even still, did the rules of suffering have any inspiration or origins, or is that something that you came up with when you were inside their head?
Primarily, it's something I came up with. There is a mentality. I live in the Midwest that, you know, among some circles, to exercise kind of a stiff upper lip and put etiquette over your own personal needs. And that was something I tried to explore in the extreme.
How does the cultural stigma surrounding depression affect the events of the play?
I came up with the idea for the play when I read a short story by David Foster Wallace, probably my favorite writer, called The Depressed Person. And it reads almost like a horror story. It chronicles this woman who hates herself and knows that she's kind of coming off as repugnant and slowly destroying her life just by being depressed. At one point, she tells a friend who is a cancer patient how lucky she is because, she knows who she is and she knows that she wants to live. And the depressed person isn't sure that she wants to live.
Mm.
She's that far into a pit that she doesn't even realize um, that there's other suffering. Well, she realizes it intellectually, but one of the best analogies I heard is when a depressed person understanding another depressed person is like a person who just had their arm chopped off trying to understand the pain of somebody who just had their leg chopped off. So the concept came to me that what if somebody devoted their entire life trying not to be selfish about their depression? And, at the time in question and still today, mental illness is kind of seen as part of having a weak will, even though we know now that it's more of a physical situation.
Absolutely. I have one last question for you, and I kind of want to circle back around to what we were talking about with um, Joseph Campbell and the monomyth and the story structure of story structures, so to speak. What role do you think myths play in our world today? And is it something about theater that makes it especially apt for telling myths?
I think there's a mythology in every medium. It just kind of uh, alters its sensibilities. Back in the day, it was kind of a word of mouth thing. Somebody would tell a story and somebody would alter it to suit their needs and so on and so forth until it was like a game of telephone. But nowadays, when you have the internet, somebody will post something out there and there's no origin or accountability necessary because everything can be anonymous and then it'll get changed or altered or exaggerated. And I think theater as kind of a more old world medium is perfect for kind of breaking things down and putting accountability back on the provider of the narrative. If a playwright writes something or a company performs it and people have questions or objections or want to challenge it, you can go back to the creator of it and say, what did you mean by this? Or could you expand upon this?
It becomes a much more intimate dialogue than a screen name or even something that's broadcast to you via television or in a movie theater.
Exactly. And, theater is kind of special in that it's live and not permanent because, you have that immediacy and that energy. And I think now that we're moving into this age of, permanency in everything you do, I mean, you've got 12-year-olds on social media and every little thought in their head goes on the internet and it's there forever. There's something special about just having this thought, executing it, and that's a moment that you only share with whoever's in the audience and whoever's on stage. And there's something that's getting more and more unique about that I think needs to be harnessed.
I think the immediacy is something that cannot be taken for granted. And digital theater, so to speak, sort of what we're doing with this podcast, offers a definite different sort of immediacy, an on-demand sort of immediacy that
Yeah.
people are able to take advantage of. And I think it plays into what you were saying before about getting new faces into the theater. So If you enjoyed Cry in the Shower, if you enjoyed our talk with Liz Leighton, buy a ticket to your local theater company. Not just 12 Peers. Go to your homegrown, hometown local theater company, buy a ticket and see a play because it's an immediate and intimate experience that you can't get anywhere else. Liz, thank you so much for joining us today, and I can't say how much of a pleasure it's been working with you these past few months. Thank you so much, Liz.
Thank you. It was great.
Thank you for joining us for our interview with Liz Leighton, playwright of Cry in the Shower. Come back next week when we take your questions from social media. The Modern Myths podcast is produced by 12 Peers Theater. Executive producer, Vince Ventura. Producers, Sarah Fisher, Matt Henderson, and Marcus Savage. Music by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Stage directions, read by Rick Siflinski. Chantal, Diana Ift. Lena, Sarah Ashley Fisher. Nurse and Mrs. Donahue, Ashley Rice. Recording location generously provided by Timesys Corporation. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review.